Hello, my name is Glenn Pinto, and I just wanted to review this group exercise that you may or may not be doing with your instructor during discovery training. In this exercise, we're asking you to basically discover a Windows machine that is running MSSQL on it. If you follow the instructions defined in the wiki article correctly, then you should be able to discover MSSQL on your box with the correct catalog information, the instance name, the TCP port, the edition version, the engine edition, and so forth. This would be coming directly from interrogating the SQL Server database that's defined. We have set up in the EC2 training environment a Microsoft SQL system that is running. If you look at the notes, the target device is IP address 10.0.0.229, and the credentials to access this device are administrator with the password MSSQL at 2008. So what I've done is I've already set up the credentials appropriately in order to make a discovery of this target device. But what I haven't done at this point is I have not correctly configured, as defined in the wiki, additional steps that need to be done on the MID server in order to correct the catalog data and the additional details around the MSSQL database. So here is the credential that I defined, administrator with my password as mentioned before, and I set up a discovery schedule in order to discover that MSSQL device. I've already run this particular discovery, so let's look at a baseline of what is collected if I do nothing else other than this. I ran discovery just a short while ago. As you can see, I actually created my Windows server, and if I click on the CMDB CI that I created, you'll notice that it actually shows that MSSQL is running on this target device. If I look at the BSM map, it shows that MSSQL is set up with a relationship to run on the Windows server. And if that's all that's required from an application mapping perspective, then you're fine. If you're concerned with additional details around this MSSQL database in terms of catalogs and some of the other attributes that I mentioned before, then you'll want to take additional steps that are defined here in the wiki. The wiki article is data collected by discovery on Microsoft SQL servers, and the requirements are to follow these 5 bullets. Let me show you one additional item before we get into that. If I click on the MSSQL application, you'll notice that I don't have a lot of information around it. I do have the relationship that it's running on the server. I have the name, and I have no version information edition, engine edition, TCP ports, instance name, and no catalogs at all. The fact that MSSQL was picked up at this point had to do with the process classifier that was defined. So out of the box, or in a baseline ServiceNow instance, we do have a process classifier that is built, and by this time you should or you will be building process classifiers in a future module, but for now you do have a process classifier here that says Microsoft SQL Server. And if I click on it, it has a simple condition that says if the command of a running process contains SQL Server.exe, then basically we will map it as Microsoft SQL Server. And so that's automatically occurs, and when that condition is met, we'll build that application relationship. On top of that, we will then execute this particular trigger probe called PowerShell Windows MSSQL, and this is the probe that's going to try to grab additional data around the database and its catalog information. This is the particular probe that does not work unless you do the additional configurations defined on the MID server itself. So in the group exercise, there is a series of items that are defined in the wiki article. I've copy and pasted them into words that we can see them a little bit larger. So these are the requirements. If I want to grab the catalog data from the database, then I have to basically execute or configure my MID server with additional information. The first requirement is around remote registry, only for those devices that are SQL Server 2000. So enable remote registry service. So in our case, our SQL Server is 2008, so we can ignore that, and that's why we have not required. You have to install .NET 3.5 and 4 on the mid-server host. So in this case, we're going to use mid-server 1 in order to discover this target device. And we already have this pre-configured on your mid-server, so you do not have to worry about that, and that's why we have it documented as already installed. The third requirement is install the Common Language Runtime. And this is required, and if you look at the wiki article, there's actually a link to where you can download and install this file. We also have to install the Shared Management Objects package, and there's also a link to find in the wiki article where you can grab that particular file. So these two are two crucial elements that have to be installed on the mid server itself in order to discover that Microsoft SQL database and its catalogs. The item here, you also have to enable Windows authentication on the mid-server host to both the target WMI and Microsoft SQL Server. Basically here we want to define in the services credential of the mid-server the target device's username and password. So in this case we have administrator and MSSQL 2008. So that's what we're going to have to define in the services credential of the mid-server that we're using to discover the MSSQL database. So this is also going to be a requirement that we have to do. And the last item, it says install PowerShell v2 on the mid-server host machine. We've already installed that on our mid-server, and we're running v2. That's how, you might recall, we configured mid-server 1 already in order to be enabled for PowerShell. Again, if you hadn't already done those steps, you would have to validate that PowerShell v2 is installed on the mid-server, and you would have to enable that mid-server parameter called use_PowerShell and set that to true. But we've already done that, and so we're good to go. One point of note, though, when you complete this exercise, in order to move on further in the class, we do have to change that services credential back to its original configuration, which was admin and then capital M disco. We're going to be modifying it to administrator and then MSSQL, and that will affect future labs if you don't modify it back to its original configuration. So I've navigated back to the wiki article, and I'm going to click on the link that says Shared Management Objects MSI. When I click on that, I'm navigated to Microsoft.com, where I can look at install instructions. If I do a edit find and search for CLR, that would be the quickest way to find the requirements that I'm looking for. So I'm not looking for this particular one. Right here it lists the Microsoft SQL Server 2012 Shared Management Objects. So this is the package that I'll have to download. This is one of the requirements that I have to install on the mid-server. So depending on your Windows system, whether it's a x86 or 64-bit, you'll have to download the appropriate package. The other item is the Microsoft System CLR types for Microsoft SQL Server 2012. You want to download the appropriate package. You'll want to install this particular package before the previous one, the SMO package, in order to continue. So I'm going to go ahead and download these two packages, and then I'm going to install the Microsoft System CLR types package first, and then I'm going to install the Microsoft SQL Server 2012 Shared Management Objects package next. It is important to note that you want to download these packages from the mid-server itself. So if the mid-server is in a remote connection, such as it is in our training environment, we want a remote desktop into that mid-server, then open up a browser from there, navigate to the wiki article, and then navigate to the Microsoft.com website in order to download these packages, because the installation will take place or have to take place on that mid-server itself. So as you can see, I've actually remote desktop into my mid-server, and I've downloaded these two files, Shared Management Objects MSI and also the SQL CLR Types MSI. I've installed both already, so I've started with the CLR types, and then I followed it up by the Shared Management Objects. Next I have to do is configure the services credential appropriately for the mid-server that I'm using. So I'm going to navigate to the mid-server that I'm using. In this case it's actually mid-server 1, and I'm going to double click on it. From here, I have the login credential. This is set to admin and mdisco. This is the credential that you are going to reconfigure now, but then you'll have to reconfigure it back to admin mdisco after you complete this exercise. So I'm going to put in administrator, and then I'm going to put in the password MSSQL at 2008, MSSQL at 2008, and then click OK. It says I have to stop and start the service, so I will right-click, and then I'll restart the service. So at this point, I've done all the configurations that have been outlined in the wiki, and I should be good to go. So remember, some of them we didn't have to do. The main things we had to do was the SLR and also the SMO installation of the MSI packages, and then we had to modify our services credential to reflect our target device. And with that said, we'll go ahead and we'll rerun discovery against that target device and see if we can populate the SQL database with a lot more catalog information and additional details. So discovery is now completed with the additional configurations I've done. As you'll notice, the BSM map does not appear any differently. The relationship is still appearing as it was before. However, if I drill into the actual SQL application, you'll notice a big difference. We have the actual instance name, TCP ports, the version, the edition, the actual version of the database of SQL, and then the engine edition and the operational status. We also have all the catalog information that now appears underneath. If these had to be mapped within the BSM map, the databases themselves, that would require manual intervention. We do not automatically display the database within the BSM, just the application, because it's an application mapping. If I move this over and take a look at the actual SQL database that we discovered, I have a copy of it here. This is the actual target device of 10.0.0.229. You'll notice here's the catalog information, and when I go to the help screen of this particular database, you'll notice that it's SQL Server 2008, and it has version 10.50.2500.0. And if we look at our discovery, you'll notice we have the same exact information that was collected. So before you end this lab, you'll want to go back into your system and remove the services credential. So that'll be a requirement before you move further within the labs. So where we defined our credential as administrator MSSQL at 2008 for mid server 1, please change that back to admin and then capital M disco, and then save that, restart the mid server 1 service before you proceed further. Hopefully this short recording has been helpful in discovering MSSQL databases on Windows servers.